Hello and welcome to yet another tutorial by Davies Media Design. My name is Michael Davies, and as most of you know by now, Inkscape recently released Inkscape 1.0 with tons of new features and improvements. Part of that release is the introduction of the brand new and much more user-friendly live path effects dialog, which I go over in my top 5 new features in Inkscape 1.0 video. Inside this new dialog, there are also many new live path effects, 6 to be exact, which I'll be going over in depth in this tutorial. There are also many experimental live path effects that were added to the program, though I won't be covering those in this video for the sake of time, and because many of these are still rough around the edges. But of course, before I get into all that, I want to direct you guys over to my website at daviesmediadesign.com. As always, I have tons of GIMP, Inkscape, and Darktable tutorials on here, as well as my GIMP book of layers and help articles teaching you how to use free software, so definitely check that out. You can enroll in my GIMP 2.10 Masterclass from beginner to pro photo editing on Udemy. You can enroll in any of my Skillshare classes by visiting gimpschool.com. And you can get more with a premium membership to Davies Media Design. Your premium membership includes access to things like my GIMP Help Center app, ebooks like my GIMP Book of Layers, and exclusive GIMP, Inkscape, and Darktable content not found on YouTube. You can start your premium membership off with a 7-day free trial, and I'll include a link to this as well as all the relevant links from this tutorial in the description of the video. Alright, so here we are inside of the brand new Inkscape 1.0, and I do want to mention I have the dark theme enabled here with the symbolic icons, and those icons are set to the color white. You can learn how to do that in my top 5 new features in Inkscape 1.0 video. But as I mentioned in the intro of this video, there have been many new live path effects added to Inkscape 1.0, and that starts with the Dashed Stroke LPE. LPE, of course, stands for live path effects. To put it simply, this effect converts a solid stroke line to a dashed line. So let's open this up, but first what I need to do is draw a path. And I'm going to demonstrate this using a circle. So the circle is going to be an object to start. And I'm just going to click and drag the circle, hold the control key to maintain the portions, or the aspect ratio I should say, and if I hold the shift key, it'll draw from the center, and I'll release. So let's grab the select tool here, drag this towards the center of our composition. And I'll change the color of this so it's a little easier to keep track of things. So I'll just click on this to make it a bluish color. Let's go with maybe a lighter blue color in the swatches panel. And then I'll hold the shift key and click on the red color. And of course I can go to Object, Fill and Stroke, or use Control-Shift-F to bring up my fill and stroke dialog over here. And then over here under Stroke Style, let's just change this unit here to pixels. And you can see this is about a 10 pixel stroke right now. Let's go with something like 15. Just to make that a bit larger. And if I hit Control-4, that's going to center up my composition here. So now we need to convert this object to a path, so I'll go to Path, Object to Path. So we have our path here now. Next, let's bring up that new Path Effects dialog, so I'll go to Path, Path Effects, and that'll bring the dialog up over here. Let's close out the Fill and Stroke dialog there, and now you'll see we have a little plus sign when we have this selected. So I'll click that plus sign. That'll bring me to the Live Path Effects Selector dialog box. This is the brand new dialog. As you can see, a lot more user-friendly here. And let's come over and click on Dashed Stroke. You can either double click on it or click this little down arrow. It'll give you more info, and then click this checkbox. So now you'll see the fill of our object here, which we converted to a path, has been removed. And the stroke of the path is now a series of dashes. Of course, if you wanted to keep the fill from the shape, you can always duplicate the shape and then keep the fill but remove the stroke from the duplicate. And then the other version of your shape that now has the dashes on it is going to maintain that stroke. And so that would give you both the fill and the stroke here. But in this case, we're just going to stick with the way it is. And over here in the Path Effects dialog, you'll now see some settings for the dashed stroke effect that we added here. The first one is the number of dashes, so this indicates how many dashes are between nodes. If I come over here and grab my Edit Paths by Nodes tool, and I click on this, you could see all the nodes here for our circle. So we've got 4 nodes, and there are 3 dashes in between each node. You'll see the third dash is actually straddled here over the node. We'll get into that later. But I'll grab my selection tool again, make sure we're clicked on our path here. So the number of dashes right now is 3, so there are 3 dashes here in between each node. The third dash is going to be the same dash that starts here. So if I increase this number to 5, You'll see now there are 5 dashes in between each node, counting the first and last. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The first and last dashes are going to be the same between nodes, which is why you only really count 3 here, but then you have the starting and ending dash. Hole factor is going to be the size of the spacing between the dashes. So right now this is set to 0 by default. I can go between 0 and 0.99999. If I go all the way up to, let's call this 1 right now, you'll see it'll automatically adjust, and that will just get rid of all of the spacing between the dashes. So the larger the number here, the smaller the spacing between the dashes. Let's go with 0.5 just to show what that looks like. And then we'll go back to 0. So you can see 0 is going to create a larger gap between the dashes there. The next option is the Use Segments checkbox. So if I uncheck this, this is instead of having 5 dashes in between each segment that starts and ends with a node. So you'll remember we had 4 nodes. So instead of having 5 dashes in between each segment there, we now just have 5 dashes total. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And if I increase this number, you'll see that will increase how many total dashes we have. So now we have 10 dashes total instead of 10 dashes between each segment, which if I click this option, you'll see that's what happens here. And now there's a lot more dashes. Let's bring that back to 5. The half start / end checkbox is going to determine when the new dash begins. So you'll remember if I grab the Edit Paths by Node tool and click on this, that the dashes straddle those start and end nodes right now. So if I come back here to my selection tool and click on this and I uncheck half start end, that's going to have a dash start here at the beginning and then end at the end node there. And then it'll also have the node start again. So that's basically going to double the size of the dashes at the nodes because you have both a dash starting and ending at the same node instead of having it straddling that node. So I'll come back over and check that. Next is the Unified Dashes option. Unified Dashes attempts to even out the size of the dashes, though this can lead to asymmetrical dashes between nodes in the end. So right now with the Unified Dashes option checked, it's trying to make each one of these dashes the same size. If I uncheck that, for this particular case, nothing happens. But in some cases, it might end in an uneven final dash somewhere like over here at one of the nodes. So I'll check that. The info box is going to give you useful information about the LPE you're using. So in this case, it says add fill between many LPE to add fill. So I had mentioned a way at the beginning of showing you this tool how to get your fill back, since the fill does tend to disappear with this tool. This is just telling you another way to get your fill back. So that's a useful piece of information here. And then below that, it says Dashed Stroke Set Default Parameters. If I check that little drop down arrow, this is going to give me options to set the default values of my Dashed Stroke LPE. So if I were to set all of these options, it's basically going to set everything I have set up right now, all of the current settings I'm using here, as the default parameters for each time I access this tool in the future. So it's not going to take effect until I close down Inkscape and then reopen it. So all I have to do is come over here and click the set button. And now if I were to close Inkscape and reopen it, the next time I would use this live path effect, the number of dashes by default would be set to 5. I could also change it right now to something like 8 and then click update. So that will be the new default next time I close Inkscape, reopen it, and use this LPE. So this feature is going to be found across all the new live path effects, so keep that in mind. I'm not going to go over it for the remaining live path effects, but it is there. The next new live path effect is the Ellipse from Points LPE. So this effect is similar to an older effect found in the previous version of Inkscape known as Ellipse by 5 points. And this original effect allows you to draw an ellipse based on a path with 5 points. This new effect is going to allow you to create an ellipse or circle from paths that contain various numbers of nodes, so not just 5. With this effect, you draw a series of nodes with the Paths tool, then add the effect from the Path Effects dialog, so I'll show you what I mean. Let me first get rid of this circle, and then I'll come over here and grab my Bezier Curves tool or my Paths tool, which a lot of you might refer to it as that if you're used to using GIMP. So let's say now I draw a series of points here. So I'm drawing this random path. Now let's come over and grab my Select tool. That will select the path we just drew. Then I'll come over and click to create a new path effect or to add a new path effect to this path. So here you'll see the original tool, which was Ellipse by 5 points, and based on the handy icon that's here, you can see that this tool required 5 different points on your path. But now we have the Ellipse from Points tool, and you can see by the icon here that this is allowing you to create paths with a different number of points. It's showing 3 here, it can be different from 3. But I can either click this down arrow once again and click the checkbox, or just click once on the tool itself. That will draw a circle around my original path. So you have to remember that a circle is a type of ellipse. It's just an ellipse that happens to have a 1:1 aspect ratio. So this tool will either draw a circle or an ellipse. So the first option here is called Method. This allows you to choose the type of ellipse that's drawn. And by the way, you can see the original path by clicking on this little source path checkbox here. So here's the original path. We have the 4 points on here. And you'll see that the circle isn't perfectly aligning with our path. The reason for that is that it wouldn't really be an ellipse if it adhered to all 4 of the paths we drew, just because of the nature of the way I drew the paths. So for this particular option, the circle is a little bit off, but it's close. But I'll come over here and change the method just to show you guys what these look like. So force circle, right now this is going to be the same because that's basically what auto ellipse did, is it forced a circle. But this typically forces a circle shape, no matter what type of path you drew. Then I'll come over here and go to isometric circle. So this will draw my circle based on an isometric grid or an isometric perspective. Some of you may have seen my isometric grid tutorial in GIMP or my isometric drawing I did in GIMP. This is going to be that same sort of concept where you have a grid that's based on a different perspective than just a flat 2D perspective. So the isometric circle here is adhering to the segments I drew as best as it can, but it can't really adhere to all 3 of these segments just based on the shape and the perspective this is taking on. The next method though is the perspective circle. So this is ignoring that sort of isometric grid and just drawing this in perspective in a way that it's perfectly adhering to the way that my original path was drawn. So you can see it's squeezing in perfectly inside of the 3 segments that were created here. And it's just taking on whatever perspective that creates. Then I'll come over here, we can go to Steiner ellipse. This is just a different type of ellipse. You'll see that this ellipse is passing through 3 of the 4 points we created, so that's about the best it could do without making it a totally irregular shape. And then finally you have the Steiner inellipse. So that's going to be an inner ellipse, drawn using that same type of ellipse, but connecting with as many segments as it can while still maintaining that shape and being drawn inside of the original path. So let's come back here and change this to auto ellipse. You also have the option to change this to an arc. So if I click on this option, you'll see that's going to open up the end here of our ellipse that aligns with the open end of my path that I drew. Other arc side is going to perform the opposite, so it'll shift and only display that little open portion instead of displaying the rest. So let me uncheck that. The next option, slice arc, is going to turn this into that little Pac-Man looking circle. So it's going to take it out as if it is a slice of a pie or a pie graph. And then the next option, let me uncheck the slice arc option and the arc option. This is going to draw a rectangle frame around my circle. And if I'm in one of the perspective modes, it'll draw that rectangle inside of that perspective. So let me come over here. We can also go with the perspective circle mode. And of course, I can always hide the path if I find that annoying, if it's getting too cluttered there. So I'll uncheck that. The next option is the axes option. So I'm going to keep this set to perspective circle. So this is going to just slice up our ellipse in perspective here. So it's showing us the axis that it's using for our perspective. And if I change this to a different mode, it's going to change the way those grids are drawn inside of the ellipse. Let's go back to perspective circle. So you'll notice that these last 2 options will only be revealed if I have the perspective option enabled. So if I go with isometric, that'll get grayed out. If I go with auto ellipse, that'll be grayed out. Steiner ellipse. But if I go with perspective circle, this allows me to draw perspective squares or a perspective axis. So let me get out of that. If I click perspective square, it's going to close off the path I created. The reason being that this path is actually a perspective square, except I missed the last segment there because I left it open. So by closing that off, it does create a perspective square and perspective axes. So this is going to draw the axes that it drew before, but instead of just drawing it as this sort of even axes, it's going to factor in the fact that this is in perspective. So in this case, it's almost like this end of our ellipse is further away, this end of the rectangle as well is further away, while this end of the rectangle and the ellipse is closer to us. So that's why the middle of this axis, the middle of these guides, is going to be shifted further away from us. You can also rotate the axes, so if I click on this, you'll see this is just going to rotate that ellipse I drew. So it's going to maintain the same perspective where whatever is on this left side here is further away from us, whatever is on the right side is closer to us, but it's just going to rotate the object here, so that will automatically update that shape based on that perspective. So that's just an easy way to rotate an object using that same perspective. So let me just set this back to 0. And as I've already mentioned, this will turn off or on the original path we drew. Of course, I have to also turn off the perspective square in order to get rid of that original path. So now we're back to the perspective circle on its own. And I'm going to hit the backspace key because I do want to get rid of that for our next live path effect. The next new LPE found in Inkscape 1.0 is called Corners, Fillet / Chamfer, and is used to create a curved corner at a joint known as a fillet and a beveled corner at a joint known as a chamfer. These terms come from architectural and technical drawing software, so they are kind of very techie terms. But if I come over here and click to draw a path using my Bezier curves tool, which I'm just going to call the paths tool from now on, I'm just going to draw some arbitrary segments here. And I'm just going to try to make these segments a bit dynamic. So each time these segments intersect, they create a corner here. And now I'm going to grab my select tool. So now that we've drawn a path, let's say we want to either bevel these edges or create rounded corners. Now I can come over here to my path effects, click to create a new path effect. And right here, you'll see the new effect, Corners, Fillet / Chamfer. So I'm just going to click on that once to apply it. So the first drop down here is the unit. So this changes the unit that's going to be used for drawing the actual corners here. And then the method is going to be how the corners are calculated, and really this only plays into effect when you're drawing a rounded corner. So you either have auto, which is going to automatically calculate those corners, or you have force arc. So force arc will draw an arc at your corners, which is usually a more consistent and rounded curve. Force Bezier, on the other hand, will draw a Bezier curve at the corner. Bezier curves typically start with a steeper slope and therefore produce more oblong curves, though the transition from the line segment to the curve itself will be smoother, as Bezier curves tend to ease into transitions, whereas an arc is more focused on it being a more even curve. So let's demonstrate here. Let me shift the method over to auto for now. And down here, you'll see a series of buttons. These allow you to select what type of corner you want to use. So fillet is going to be a rounded corner. So I'll hold Control and zoom in. Right now, there is no difference. This is still a pointy corner. And the reason for that is we haven't done anything to the radius. So the radius is going to determine the size of the actual corner here. So the larger the number, the larger the effect is going to be. And I'll get into how the radius is determined in a second. But for now, let's just turn this up to a higher number. Let's just go with something like 40 for now. And I'll hit the tab key. So now you'll see we have these rounded corners. And the method is set to auto right now. So I'll hold Control and zoom in on one of these corners. If I change the method to force arc, nothing's going to happen because the auto method automatically had this corner set to force arc. But if I come over and change this to force Bezier, you'll see that will elongate the corner slightly, not by a whole lot, but I'll hold Control, zoom out. You can see it more towards these more intense corners. So this corner takes a sharper turn. If I change the method here back to force arc, you'll see how much more rounded that is. And if I come back and do force Bezier, this is creating a steeper slope here at the beginning, and it more gradually eases into the transition while it's turning the corner, and that creates this more oblong arc shape, or this more oblong rounded corner, I should say. So hold Control and zoom out. So the method pretty much applies mostly to whenever you're using the fillet option. Let's click over to chamfer now. So you can see our radius is set to 40 with chamfer, and that is causing these edges to become beveled. So instead of being rounded, now they have this sort of cut through going on here. And if you wanted to see the original nodes of this path, you can grab your Edit Paths by Nodes tool, and that will show the nodes here, as well as the knots, which I'll get into a little bit later. But let's come back, grab the selection tool. Of course, if I shrink the radius size, hit the tab key, that will decrease the size of these chamfers here, the size of these beveled corners. But the next option is the chamfer steps. This is only going to work if you have one of the chamfer options selected. And the inverse chamfer option is actually going to reverse the chamfer going on here. It's not going to do anything if you click it when you only have one chamfer step, but here you can adjust the number of chamfer steps. So if I go to 2, you'll see that will create 2 bevels going on, and in this case it's going to invert it. Let me click the regular chamfer so you can see this is what it usually looks like. And if I go with 3 chamfers, hold the control key and zoom in, you'll see now there are 3 bevels. So that's just splitting that beveled segment up into however many chamfer steps we create, and that's also allowing for the inverse chamfer option to work. If we only have one step, the reason inverse chamfer doesn't work is because this is just splitting in between the middle anyway, so there's no way to really flip this on an axis, versus when we add chamfer steps, that's causing this to bend either inward or outward depending on whether or not we have this inversed. Let me come back to 1 for this and also come back to the fillet. And the reason for this is I just want to demonstrate this is what the inverse fillet does. It's just going to flip that arc. So now it's turning inward. So this is the normal one where it goes outward, and this is the inward option. If I hold control and zoom out, you can see this is what it looks like across the board. So let's switch back to chamfer. The next option is to set the radius amount based on the percent. So right now the radius amount we set is 30, and then it's using the units here, which is pixels. So the radius here is going to be 30 pixels, but when I check the radius in percent option, that's going to change the radius amount from pixels to a percentage of the line segment. So I found in my testing that the percentage is based on whatever the second line segment is for the corner. So we have one line segment coming in this way and a second one coming in this way. I found in my testing that it takes the radius percentage from this segment here. So this beveled edge will now be 30% of the size of this line segment. So it should be around from here to about maybe here or so. Right now nothing happened, but if I come over here and I just adjust this down and then back up, now you can see this does indeed look like it's 30% of this line, and the same is going to be true across all of the beveling happening here. So this is for the chamfer option. Let me come over to fillet. So you can see the rounding of the corners here is now much larger. This corner is much larger than the others because this line segment is so much longer than the others. And of course, let me increase this to 50. That will now be 50% of those line segments. And if I uncheck this option and then I adjust this again, you'll see those will shrink back because now they're going to be 50 pixels instead of 50% of the line segment. The next option is to use knots distance instead of radius. So this option is a bit complicated, but if I come over here and I double click on this, you'll see now we have our nodes displayed here. And as I mentioned, these are going to be our knots. So the knots are basically the point at which the curves or the corners begin and then the point at which they end. So what this option will do is it's going to use the distance between these knots instead of using the radius of the corner. So this has been checked the whole time. If I uncheck it and then redo the radius amount, you'll see that this will change now. So that's just another way to draw your radius. Of course, I can draw the chamfer as well. So if I change this back to use knots distance instead of radius, you'll see that will change up the unit there and make these smaller in this case. The next option is to apply changes if radius equals 0. So this has been checked by default. Basically what this means is that if there hasn't been any sort of corner applied to anything yet, this will apply whatever changes you make inside of the effects dialog here. On the other hand, if this option is unchecked, it's only going to apply whatever changes you want to make to your corners on corners that already have a change to them. So anything that has a non-zero value. In other words, if that corner is already rounded or already beveled. So let me demonstrate this option in action by resetting all the radii to 0. So now all of these have 0 values. Right now this is checked, which means if I increase the radius here, that will apply those changes to all of these. But let me come back. Let's reset this back to 0. If I uncheck this option and then try to increase the radius, nothing's going to happen. So let's once again reset this back to 0. So something else you can do with this live path effect is you can click on a single node and only edit that node. So let's say, for example, we change the radius of just this one node right here. So I clicked and dragged this, and this is dragging the knots here. So now only one corner here is beveled. None of the other corners here have a non-zero value. So if this option is unchecked and I increase the radius, you'll see that only that one node there that had the non-zero value is going to change. None of the other nodes will change. On the other hand, if that option is checked and I change this, now all of those nodes will have their corner values changed. So the opposite effect will occur with the next option, which says apply changes if radius is greater than 0. So let's say I come up here and I increase these values. So we'll increase all of them to 40. Now if I uncheck this option, all of these values are greater than 0. So if I come back up here and try to change the radius size, none of these values will change. And then on the other hand, let me just drag this corner here. So this now has a 0 value, and maybe this one as well. So now I have two corners with 0 values. So now with this option unchecked, if I change the radius, it's only going to allow one change. So you have to manually type the radius here. You can't hold your mouse like this and have it adjust, because once these change their values to a non-zero value, they now qualify here as being greater than 0. So this option will no longer work on them. So if both of these options are unchecked, that means that none of these corner values will change, no matter if they are 0 values or non-zero values. So for example, that one's a 0 value now. If I change the radius, nothing will happen to any of these. So let me just click to apply both of these. The next option here is to change only selected nodes. So if I have this option checked, and then I come over here, so we have a node here. If I click on that, this is the only selected node, which means now if I come over and change the radius, that is the only node that's going to be affected. This is useful whenever you want to have mixed cornering. So for example, you want some of these to be rounded and some of them to be beveled. So right now we have this one selected. If I change it to fillet, that becomes a rounded corner. This one is still beveled, this one's still beveled. If I wanted to, I could click on this node as well, change that to fillet. I could change the size of the radius. So this just allows me a bit more freedom to customize the various corners here in my path. All right, so let's leave this path for the next effect. The next new effect is the Measure Segments LPE. This slide path effect automatically inserts the measurements of straight paths like in architectural drawings. So with our current path that we already have drawn here, let's add another path effect. And for those of you who are beginners, you can add multiple path effects to a single path. And I can use the little search box here and type in measure. So here we have measure segments. And if I click on that, that will add this new effect here to my path. So you can see what this does is it's going to add the measurements here for each segment. So we've got a measurement for this segment, and then when it becomes a curve, it's giving us a new measurement there. And that's just happening all around. So there are plenty of customization options for this. The first option here, let me just scroll down a bit. So you can change the unit. So right now we're in millimeters. I can go centimeters. And some of these, by the way, do make the arrows and some of the other lines in here look funky, but let's just change the unit back to millimeters here. But the next option is to change the orientation of the labels. So right now they are parallel to the segment. There are instances where they will be perpendicular if the segment is too small. I'm actually not sure why that's not doing it there. But right now these are all parallel, so I can change the orientation. For example, we can go with horizontal. So that just makes all of the measurements either perfectly horizontal, or in the case of these vertical paths, it will align it vertically with that path. You can also come over here, change it to vertical. So that's going to do the opposite. So let's come over here and just go with parallel for now. The next option is to change the font of the measurements displayed here. So by default, this is sans normal. If I click on this, we could change the type of font being used. So you can see there are a variety of fonts. All the fonts that are available in Inkscape will be in here. So I can go with this font here, and then I can also change the size of the font. So I can use the little slider here, or I can manually change the value. So let's go with something like 15 and click select. The next option is merge overlaps, and these allow you to set the point at which overlapping dimension lines, which are the lines in the drawing here denoting the start and ending of segments. So it's the point at which these lines are merged into a single dimension line. All right, so I'm actually inserting a new example for this just because I think the original example I did for the merge overlaps wasn't abundantly clear. But I just want to show you guys that I've drawn a path here that is pretty zigzagged, and because of the shape of this path, there is an overlap happening here in the middle. So what merge overlaps is doing is it's defining the point at which the dimension lines are going to be merged into a single dimension line. So as you can see here, even though there are two paths right here that should both have dimension lines, there's only a single one here. And then the actual measurements for both of these segments are up top here. So they've just sort of been thrown loosely in a different location in order to try to have both of these measurements displaying without them overlapping right here. So if I come over to merge overlaps, if I set this to 180, that's automatically going to turn off all merging of overlapping dimension lines. So now you can see both of these dimension lines are showing up here, and they're both overlapping each other because they are in such close proximity to one another. And there is a point for this particular angle, this particular segment, at which these overlapping measurements will no longer occur. So 180 just automatically turns that off, but if I go to something like 3 degrees, hit the enter key, these are still going to overlap, and I can sit here and manually increase this amount. And you'll see once I hit 10 degrees, that's the point at which these merging overlapping dimension lines will unmerge, essentially, to put it a simple way. So that's what the merge overlaps feature does. Back to the original recording. But the next option is the position option. Position is the distance the measurements, labels, and dimension lines will be displayed from the line segment that it is measuring. So in other words, all elements of the labels here will be shifted upwards or downwards depending on whether you increase or decrease this value. So right now we're set to 5. If I go lower, this will get closer. If I go higher, this will push all those measurements outwards. So let's bring that back in. Let's go with something like 7. The next option is label position. This will only move the measurement labels here. So you'll see what happens when I increase this or decrease it. It's only going to shift those measurement labels. The next option is the help line distance. So that's going to be these little lines here. And this option is going to change how far away these lines are from the original segment. So you'll see that as I increase this value, that's going to increase the distance there. So that just kind of cleans this up a bit. And if I decrease this value, that just causes some weird things to happen there. So the bottom portion of these lines will extend basically beyond the original segment. So I'm just going to increase this. I like having a tiny bit of separation there, so let's just go with 2. The next option is the help line elongation. So if you want to make these little lines taller, you can increase the value here or make them shorter by decreasing the value. I'm going to make these slightly taller. Finally, you have the line width, so that's the width of the lines themselves in here. So I can increase this value, that's of course making those lines thicker, or I can decrease the value, that will make these lines thinner. And you can see in some cases when we make the lines thinner, that brings back some lines. So some dimension lines popped back up in here, whereas if I make them thicker, that causes them to disappear. Finally, the scale option allows you to change the scaling factor. So right now this is 1:1, which means this segment is exactly 71.67 millimeters. So if I wanted to change the scaling factor for something like an architectural drawing that I'm doing for a house in the real world, obviously I don't want to have to draw the exact size of the house inside my computer. That would create a massive file. So you could change the scaling factor here, and that way units can represent larger objects, so you can create smaller drawings based on a certain scaling factor. So for example, if I change this to 10, now it's saying that the actual size of this segment in the drawing is 10 times larger in real life or in whatever medium we're actually using this drawing for, and that's represented here in the units. So there's also some additional checkboxes here, some additional options. You can set the arrows to be outside. So instead of having the arrows inside the help lines, now they are located outside. You can flip which side the measurements are on, so now they're located inside the segments instead of outside. The next option here is scale sensitive, and to be honest, I couldn't figure out what exactly it is that this does based on my testing. We can see here it says when the path is grouped and the group is then scaled, adjust the dimensions. I tried testing this out based on these instructions here, and I couldn't figure out what exactly it is that this does. So if you know, let me know in the comments. The next option here is to rotate the labels. This will simply rotate these numbers here. So it rotates the measurements, puts them on a different axis. The next option says hide line under label. So here you can see the dimension line stops here at the measurement label and then it starts back up again. So if I uncheck this option, that just allows the line to go right through that. So it doesn't look quite as good there. And then the final option here, if you have labels overlapping one another, this will try to avoid that when it's checked. So when it's unchecked, you can see this is just allowing things to be a bit tighter, and right there you can see it's overlapping. If I check that again, that's going to clean that up. So for the sake of time, I'm going to skip over the projection tab and go straight to the options tab. So this tab allows for some more customization of the lines here, of the measurements, as well as the styling. So for example, we could change the color and opacity of the measurements here. So if I change this to something like a red color, you'll see that all of these measurements These labels will switch over to red. I can also change the precision of the decimals here. So right now this is set to 2, which means we're going to 2 decimal places. I can go to more decimal places if I want, or I can go to less. I can even go to no decimal places. So we could change the label format. We have pretty much 3 options. We can do both measure and unit, or we can do just measure or just unit. So the next option is for the blacklist segments, and what this does is it's going to hide any of the segments you denote here based on a numerical value. And by default, obviously, you can't really tell what value is going to be what. But if I come over here and click the Show Segment Index option, that's going to show you what numerical label these are using. So it's going to start with 0 and it's going to go all the way to 7. So for example, let's say I thought it was a bit crowded at this corner and I wanted to hide those. I could type in 1 and 6. So come over here, type 1, 6, click the checkbox, and now those 2 labels will disappear. I can now get rid of the Show Segment Index, and that gets rid of that. If I wanted to invert it so that only those 2 corners display, just click this little checkbox, and that will invert our blacklisted segments. I'm going to delete this and hit the check mark because I don't want any of these to be blacklisted, and then uncheck that. I'll skip over the next option as well as the last option because those are both pretty niche, but the final option that I'll go over is to hide the arrows. So when I click on that, that will get rid of the arrows here inside of those dimension lines. The final tab is the Help tab. This just displays some of the features in here a bit more. Those of you that are still with me, thank you for continuing to watch this tutorial. I know some parts are a bit technical just based on the new live path effects that have been added, but the next new LPE feature is the offset effect. This effect can be used to offset a shape's size by a numerical value, as well as do things like add a stroke around text. So for starters, let's get rid of this path that we've been working on, and now I'm going to grab my text tool, and I'm just going to click on my canvas with the caps lock key, and I'm just going to type open source, just random text here. And let me hit Control-A to select all the text and just increase the size of this text a bit. Grab my select tool. Let's center this up. So now that we have our text, you'll see right now we cannot add a path effect to this. We have to come over here to Path, Object to Path. So now that plus button will appear there, but first let me duplicate this text. So I'll hit Control-D to duplicate that. If I move it out of the way, you'll see now I have 2 of these. I'll hit Control-Z. That's going to ensure we have our regular text remaining underneath here, as well as this new offset we're going to create. So on the duplicate, I'll come over here, click the plus button, and here you'll see the new Offset LPE. I did clear the search box earlier, by the way. So once you clear that, you'll see the Offset LPE, and I'll just click the little checkbox. So right now, nothing has happened because we haven't set any offset amount. So I'll start by doing that. So over here, you have the offset field, and let me change this to 10 for now. Hit the tab key. So you can see what happens there. You can also change the color of this. So right now, these are both set to black. For example, if I just click on the blue color here from my swatches, and then let's come over here and move this to the back. So I'll lower that to the bottom of the stack. There you can see it's adding a nice stroke around the text. So let me decrease this. Actually, first let me change the unit so I can change this to pixels, and then decrease this to 10 pixels. You also see up top there's a drop down here called Join. So this is just basically going to be the way that the corners of your text are going to be displayed here. So by default, it'll be set to miter. And what miter does is it essentially clips the points so that they don't get too pointy. But I have a variety of other options here. I can go with beveled, for example, or I can click and go with extrapolated arc. So I can just go down the line here. Some of these on the surface don't really appear to do anything. You guys can play around with those. And then you also have rounded here, so that will round the corners. So if I have the miter option selected, you'll see down here I have miter limit, so that's just limiting how pointy these ends can be. If I have the force miter option checked, that's going to override whatever limit I set here and just automatically clip those points. But if I uncheck that, and let's say I put the miter limit to 0, you'll see that will change the shape of this. It actually looks more like the beveled option when we do that. Or if I set this to something like 50, you can't really tell with these letters right here. I'll show you guys another example in a second, but let me reset this back to 4 and hit the Enter key. So the last option here is called Live Update, and if my text right now looks a bit different, it's because this feature has actually caused my Inkscape to crash twice during this tutorial recording. So I'm not going to demonstrate it here in real time because I don't want to deal with the crash again. But usually what happens with this is you grab the Edit Paths by Nodes tool and you can adjust or transform the path that you've offset here. And having this checked will just update the offset in real time. It does slow things down and it does seem to require quite a bit of computing power, so I'm not going to do it here with the text that I have going on here at least. But I do want to demonstrate the offset effect with a path instead of text. So let's come over here, grab the pen tool, and just draw a quick path there like so. Grab the select tool. Now I'll go to Object, Fill and Stroke. So clicking Fill and Stroke. Come up to stroke style, let's change this to pixels, and we'll go with 5 pixels here to make it thicker. All right, so I'll exit out of that, and under path effects, I'll click to add a new effect, go with offset. Now let's offset this by 20. So that creates a crazy shape here. If I come over and uncheck Force Miter, you can see this is what happens. So now instead of having that really long pointy end, it's automatically chopped that off. And if I change this to 0, you can see that gets even worse. But if I up the miter limit, that's going to allow for a pointer end. So that was just something I wanted to demonstrate that I referenced a bit earlier. So I'll hit the backspace key to get rid of that. So the last new live path effect introduced in Inkscape 1.0, excluding the experimental LPEs, are actually a duo of effects. So this is going to be the power clip and power mask effects. These effects allow you to clip or mask a smaller object from a larger path, or in other words, produce a cutout in the middle of a lower path when you have 2 paths. So you'll see what I mean in a second. So let's start by getting rid of this text here. We don't need this anymore. And I'm going to draw one object here. So this will be a rectangle type shape, and then we'll draw a circle. And let me change the properties of the circle. So I'm going to click, we'll make that a pinkish color, shift click, make that a green. So right now with just the single object selected, if I click the plus sign here, you'll see these 2 LPEs are actually grayed out. So the power clip and the power mask, both of these are grayed out right now. And if I grab my select tool and select both of these objects, the little plus sign here is grayed out, and the reason for that is you can only select one object or one path at a time for this to work. So what I have to do first is go to Path, Object to Path, and then go to Object, Clip, and then here you'll see it says Set Inverse LPE, or you can come to Mask, and that has the same option. So this is where these live path effects are located. So now I'm going to go with the clip option first and click on that. So once we do that, that will cut the smaller shape or the top shape out of the bottom shape. And then that will also add that power clip effect here under path effects automatically. And under power clip, you'll see we have some options. So we can inverse the clip, which is going to be the default. That's how that cutout is happening. If I uncheck that, that will bring that back to a normal clip. So let me click the inverse clip again. You can flatten the clip. That's just going to add a stroke using the same stroke from the bigger shape here or the bottom shape around the cutout. And you can see there's some directions here in the info box. If this isn't working for you, you can go to the fill and stroke dialog box and change the fill rule to even odd. So that should fix that. Mine's working in this case. And finally, you have the hide clip option. So that will just temporarily disable that clip. And if you wanted to see what was going on behind the scenes, you can use the new split view mode using Control-6, and you can see what's happening here. So the inner circle here is our clip, and then you can see the border of our rectangle there. So Control-6 to get rid of that. So I'll leave that where it is, hold Control, zoom out. Let's create another shape. So let's move this out of the way. So I'll create another rectangle, and then this time I'm going to create a circle. So click and drag this circle, hold the Control key. Instead of having this be a bunch of colors, I'm just going to change this to be a gray color, and then I'm going to shift click on none to get rid of the stroke. The reason I'm doing that is that the difference between a clip and a mask is that a clip is going to basically just cut out the entire shape no matter what, whereas a mask will mask out the layer below, but it's going to do that with either full or partial transparency, or it's going to create full opacity depending on the color you use. So just like for those of you who are used to using GIMP, anytime you have a layer mask with white, that's going to create full opacity. A layer mask with black is full transparency, and anything with a middle gray, like in this case, will be a partial transparency. So what you see here is a grayish color. It should partially cut a hole in this, but leave some of the original color here behind. So it should be partially transparent in the middle here. Once again, I'll grab my select tool, shift click to select both of these. And this time I'm not going to convert these to a path, so I'm just going to go straight to Object, Mask, Set Inverse LPE. So there you'll see that this will mask this out, and because we used a middle gray color, it's only partially making that transparent. And then you have some of the same options over here. You'll see this one's called Power Mask instead of Power Clip. You can still invert it like so, or you can hide the mask altogether. Or you have the option to add a background behind the mask. So right now this is set to white. We could change this to another color if we wanted to, and that will affect how this looks behind here, behind the partial transparency. So if I exit out of that, it's just going to be a slight difference in this case. So there's our power clip and our power mask. All right, so that's all 6 of the new LPEs or live path effects found in Inkscape 1.0. And that's it for this tutorial. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, you could check out my YouTube channel at youtube.com/daviesmediadesign. Don't forget to click the bell icon and be notified each time I have a brand new tutorial. You can also check out any of the links to my resources in the description of the video. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.